There are three sets of main speakers. Edward Fitzgerald was the only lawyer present. He's the barrister speaking there on behalf of Julian Assange. Everybody else was there via, so the other lawyers and even some journalists were there via telephone conference. And that includes the prosecution, Claire Dobbin, who is speaking on there on behalf of the US government. So it's important to understand that the US government is the other party being represented in court, not, say, the British government or the Crown Prosecution Service. And the US government was there opposing his release. They spoke first. Their main arguments were, and maybe I can get a quote correctly. It's not for any court to preempt any decision which the Ministry of Justice may make in this respect. So she said, according to the Bail Act 1976, the arrangement of protection for those in prison is up to the Ministry of Justice, not a judge. She also noted that it's been widely reported that the government may start releasing people on temporary license after risk assessments have been done. So she's saying this is up for the Ministry of Justice to do, and really it's not for you to preempt what the Ministry of Justice will do. She also told the court that argued that the health of an individual won't be relevant to the risk of a defendant absconding while on bail. That's a quote. She said, to continue, we say that on behalf of the United States, there are substantial grounds for believing that Mr. Assange, if on bail, would abscond, would commit other offenses, or would otherwise obstruct the course of justice. He's already indicated that he's willing to go to almost any lengths to avoid being extradited to the United States. We say that the risk of flight is insurmountable, she argued. So you get the idea of her main arguments. This is the lawyer representing the United States government. She spoke first via a telephone link, as I said. She also then specifically dealt with the fact that, hey, look, there was another extradition case towards Sweden, and there was surety guarantees that were made, and people who spoke on his behalf, and arguments that were said that, he wouldn't want to reduce the image and the reputation of WikiLeaks, not only himself in front of his supporters, that he's a man of honor, that £100,000 was put up, etc., as collateral, and then in the end he absconded, right? And then he absconded to the embassy. This is what she argued.
Okay.
And this is quite important because the judge ended up referring quite strongly as well to this case. So this, by the way, I think if people wonder why it is that the lawyers never made previous bail applications, you have to understand the thinking and mentality of judges here, and possibly in other countries as well, possibly in the United States, that if you have somebody whose conviction, to be fair, his only conviction in any case, but nonetheless, who's convicted of absconding while on bail, also in terms of an extradition case, where it was argued that the reason he did this was because he feared extradition to the United States, you can understand why they wanted perhaps to wait until they had a strong enough legal footing to be able to present a bail application, because you don't want to just make an application that'll be rejected and not really have good grounds to appeal, because you can run out, if you like, you can have too many bites of the apple. So you have to be strategic with the applications. And that was the main argument of the other side. So what I already said, along with the fact that, look, he was on bail before and he violated bail, so you can't trust him, right? If anything, he said this is about extradition to the United States. Well, the reason he violated bail before is because he said he feared extradition to the United States. So that's their argument, right? Then Fitzgerald comes along. He says, look, this was historic. The factors that were in play 8 years ago aren't in play now. His father will be based here. In fact, his father comes back and forth between Australia, spends like half his time here. Also, his partner with children will be based here. In fact, his partner's identity was not revealed. There was a push for her name to be made anonymous, to be anonymized. The judge didn't agree, but she did agree that there would be a reporting restriction, at least until 7th of April, and then it'll be up to the press to argue why the anonymity should be pulled. Press did try to argue today that it was pulled, not me, but one of my colleagues at Press Association did try to argue that it's in the interests of the public to know what his partner's name is. but there's also concern about the children being harassed, etc.,
Yeah.
because of the media frenzy. So, but that's a side issue, really. So she submitted her own witness statement saying, look, it's me, his children, we're going to be based in this house. It's separate, it's not close to London. Um, so it's not like there's an embassy that he'll be close to that he'll be run by. There'll be all kinds of conditions, ankle bracelets, etc., that can be done. Fitzgerald also argued that, look, we have, you know, people who are alleged to be violent terrorists who are kept in custody outside of prison, right? So there are means and measures whereby if we can do this with people who are suspected of being incredibly violent, dangerous terrorists, then we can do it with somebody who's not accused of any kind of violent offense, right? Um, and then there's also the health aspect. He presented three witness statements from doctors, three reports from doctors, two of which have have examined Julian Assange on multiple occasions. They said while technically Assange doesn't fall into the category of vulnerable groups as currently defined by the government, which is defined comes from NHS, comes from Public Health England, right, the Public Health Department. They said, first of all, that is being adapted over time in terms of who falls into the vulnerable category. And also he's had 4 separate respiratory tract infections just while in the embassy. He's had infections with his tooth that wasn't dealt with. He has early onset osteoporosis. He has depression, which also means weakened immune system, all this time of isolation. So they said that they do believe, nonetheless, that he is in a vulnerable state. There's a very high likelihood of him getting infected because he's a prisoner, like all other prisoners. And
Yeah.
that seems to be the generally accepted position, by the way, that including from the president of Prison Governors Association. They said it's almost guaranteed that prisoners are going to start dying because of the level of concentration of prisoners, as well as the unhygienic, overcrowded conditions that they're in. But they also said that he, like everyone else, is at high risk of infection, but he's also, they consider him to be in a vulnerable category. So that was a key part of the argument. There was also the legal preparation argument. They said, we don't think, quite frankly, that the hearing is going to be able to go ahead on the 18th of May. But even if it is, and even if it's not, he needs to prepare. And we're already having difficulties preparing under normal conditions. I already mentioned the fact that the lawyers aren't getting proper access. He's not getting proper access to his case file, right, etc. And that's been going on for months. But also, we can't visit our client now. And there's video link option, but there's a queue for that. And right now, the queue, we won't be able to speak to him till next week. Like, there's a queue because there's other prisoners who want to access video link, right?
Yeah.
It's not like
Well,
there's
and they've
50
got,
video
I'm
link.
sorry to interrupt, but they've got to know that that's not a secure video link. There's no lawyer-client confidentiality over that video link.
Well, that wasn't mentioned. I would imagine that if that was said to the judge, they'd probably argue that it is. This kind of video link the government can be trusted not to listen in to, which would be ironic, of course, given the fact that the government, we know for a fact, was spying on him, lawyer-client conversations while they're in the embassy. But anyway, that's a separate issue. But so to be fair, an interesting point actually, and I discussed this with the lawyer after the hearing was over. She never addressed that particular point, by the way, in her judgment. But just to finish off those arguments before I come to her judgment, which was, so we can't properly prepare for the case. How can we do this when it's like, when there's a massive queue and it's got to be done via video link, right? So that means, we have even less access to our client than we normally did, which was insufficient before. He's at high risk of infection. He's now looking at 23 hours or more of isolation, which exacerbates his mental state, his depression, right? We already had a report from 3 separate medical professionals saying that Julian Assange shows the symptoms of being psychologically tortured, and part of that is extreme isolation, right? Part of the contributing factor.
Yeah.
We're looking at now 23 hours or more of isolation now because of the lockdown, with only 40 minutes, with only a brief 30 minutes exercise in a small yard with 40 other prisoners, right? Which, given COVID-19 is all about transmitting a high risk of transmission when you're in close contact. On the one hand, he suffers, like other people perhaps, from extreme isolation now, more isolation because of lockdown, which exacerbates his mental health. On the other hand, what little rec access he's got when he's not in his cell will be with 40 other people in a very small area, right? So it's like, and also queuing up. He said queuing up for the video link, you can see there's all kind of chances of getting contaminated. So
Yeah.
it's like, it's and it's not just to be clear, it's not just good lawyering, say, from the defense side. Like I said, there have been multiple reports I've read that have been published over the last week or two, which made very clear that prisons are massive incubators for contagious illnesses. Iran, for example, has released over 70,000 prisoners. 70,000. You can't imagine that Iran would be doing that for no reason, right? They're
And
doing it
Iran did
because of,
that
yeah,
2 weeks ago.
yeah,
Or
yeah,
at least a week and a half ago. I
yeah,
read the
exactly.
number is 85,000. It could be lower, but the point that I made was, according to the West, Iran is this brutal theocratic regime that has
Yeah.
no value for the lives of their own citizens, but they can release tens of thousands of prisoners, and Julian Assange still languishes in Belmarsh.
Yes, exactly, exactly. And so the point is that it is recognized that like prisons, that any that's why the social distancing rules are in effect for all of us. The 2 meters, no more than two people in a group. It is precisely on that basis to reduce, to as much as possible, reduce the spread of the illness while all kinds of measures can be taken in terms of beefing up the healthcare system, as well as working towards a vaccine. So these are the main arguments posed, right? That you can take more severe conditions to ensure that he doesn't abscond. You know, the kinds of things that you would do. Think about the kinds of things you do for somebody accused of serious terrorism offenses, but who isn't imprisoned, because that is done. House arrest, all kinds of house arrest. Um, there's the health. There's the legal preparation. Also 12 guarantors. So they found guarantors and all the rest of it. So then the judge comes with her decision. Her decision was to refuse the application. She didn't address any of the parts in terms of violation of his right to due process or his access to lawyers. She didn't mention that in the statement. I should also mention right now that her statement was made pretty much immediately, so it was prepared. So obviously she'll have had some of the arguments in advance, right?
Mm.
It's not like she wouldn't have heard any of the arguments. Some of it would have been sent to her in advance to prepare, because that is normal here. Where
Yeah.
even though you have an oral hearing, legal submissions are made previously. But the point is, the arguments were made, and then as soon as the arguments were done, and it was clear that everyone had finished, he'd finished his summation. She took a breath and then started to read from a prepared statement. So she had already, it's clear to me at least, she'd already made a decision on the papers. I suppose arguably she might say, well, I could have been convinced otherwise orally and then changed my mind, right? So I made the decision on the papers on the basis that, I've made my decision, but I'll let people come up to their own decision about that. She outlined the brief history of the case, noting that he'd previously absconded from bail. She considered that to be quite significant. That was key to her decision. In terms of the healthcare aspect, she said, well, she notes that the three doctors disagree with aspects of the government's guidelines. Yeah, but she said, the government is being guided by scientific advice, data-driven advice from Public Health England. And I'm sure with all these people who are working, 1,000+ people in Public Health England working on a science-based approach, are providing the best possible rational advice for the government, and the government will base its decision on what to do with prisoners based on what they're being told. And I have no reason to consider that they will do anything other than what is in the best interests of the prisoners, right? So that was a key part of what she'd said, if you like.
Does anybody
Another
buy that, by the way? Like, is that an acceptable answer to anyone sitting in that gallery?
Well, I mean, people can't exactly shout out or anything, right? So you
Fair enough.
listen to the arguments and then you just go from there. She said, quote, "It's the government's responsibility to protect both the vulnerable and those outside the category. And I have no reason to doubt that Public Health England will provide the appropriate advice to the government to ensure the health and well-being of the prison population." She also then says later on, um, After a warrant was issued for his arrest, he remained unlawfully at large for many years, and he has every reason to try and abscond again. There are substantial grounds to believe if I released him today, he will not return to face his extradition hearing. There are no conditions that could allay this concern, and this application for bail is therefore refused. Right? So that was the long and the short of it is he has a history of absconding. Um, in terms of his health, okay, fine. The doctors say that they have concerns, but he isn't technically in that category. That category, he doesn't have one of those illnesses that makes him specifically in that category of higher risk. She notes the fact that the doctors sort of disagree perhaps with the government guidelines, but okay, those are the government guidelines, which will be updated. She also noted the fact that the government is looking at releasing possibly some prisoners, and that will be decided in due course, because that was said at the beginning, right, by the U.S. government representative. And she also said that, quite frankly, I don't think that if he's released, that he will come to court. I think that he is, he himself has said, as we've seen in defense statements, that he would rather commit suicide than be deported to the United States, and that shows that he will go to any measures to avoid, and I think that would include absconding. And so, for the reasons that I think that his health will be taken care of, and the fact that he will abscond because he has a past history of doing it, and I'm not convinced that there's any conditionality that he can be subjected to that would prevent him from absconding. So I'm refusing the application, and that was essentially that. Although I did say that the lawyer told me that they will appeal.
So
No, he said we will likely appeal. That's what he told me. He said we will likely be appealing.